Rules Committee, come to order, and welcome back, and thank you for taking time to be with us today. I note that I've got several really good friends here today. Louise, a young man I went to kindergarten with, a gentleman from Dallas, Texas, William G. Baird. This young man that's on the front row, and his young wife from Baylor University, Bill and Kara Baird. And it's really, really dear friends, but we cheated. We're not just friends, we're fraternity brothers. And Deb Campbell and Ed Tarpley, who are back over there, friends of mine from Louisiana, their daughter is one of our interns, and they came up to visit, and we said now would be the best time.
Absolutely.
So thank you. Thank you.
We had an interesting time.
Yeah. This afternoon, the Rules Committee will consider H.R. 23, the Gaining Responsibility on Waters Act of 2017, as well as H.R. 2810, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018. H.R. 23 is a response to the water supply crisis that is facing much of the American West. This legislation fixes, I think, or comes close to fixing, a broken regulatory system that has really intensified the effects of the drought and replaces it with what we hope are bipartisan solutions to help provide drought relief to families, farms, the environment, and of course the American economy. This has been an issue that we've talked about for many years, and it has not gone away. Drinking water is most important, and throughout California, helping to get the state through periods of extended drought will help not only those that live in California, but also those all across the West who are facing with many of the same types of issues, whether purchasing food at the grocery store or whether you are simply out for recreation. I think this is legislation that as we delve into it, we will see the advantages of this new piece of legislation. Committee also will consider National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018, the annual primary legislative vehicle through which the Congress advances the vital funding and authorizes that American military is given the requirements to move forward yet another year. The NDAA provides all branches of the military with resources and supplies necessary to fulfill their many responsibilities. At a time of unprecedented worldwide threats, the NDAA strives to ensure that our military forces are agile, effective, ready, and most of all, lethal with the best equipment, with the best training, and with the best young men and women who this country have provided as a result of their joining an all-volunteer military. I commend the Armed Services Committee for their tireless work. I turned on the Inside TV, and saw Mac Thornberry up about 30 hours, it seems like. He did a great job. He, as well as Adam Smith, know that their duty and responsibility is to the young men and women and the families that have given their loved ones to this country. They deserve our support. They also deserve us getting our work done and providing the military with their money on or about October the 1st, I hope. I'd like to welcome the Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, the gentleman from Clarendon, Texas, Chairman Thornberry, as well as the ranking member, my locker mate down at the gym, Louise, who he and I spend a good bit of time with each other, and I'm pleased not only call him friend, but his active service for our country, who both put in long hours, the oversight in this legislation. And before we get started, I want to thank them for their commitment to the armed services. Both these young men have balanced ideas about things that will help our military. So before we get to you, I'm going to defer to the gentlewoman, the ranking member, for any opening comments she'd like to make. The gentlewoman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have an opening statement. I know we've got an awful lot to get through with today, so I'm anxious to hear from the witnesses.
Well, we're going to hear it straight on. Thank you very much, Louise. Chairman Thornberry, you spent a good week at home hearing from people about all that are in the bill. We've received over 400 amendments, the most ever at the Rules Committee. I would anticipate we will make the most ever in order, the amendments, the ideas from our colleagues. The way we're going to proceed in this matter is we're going to have a rule that will include both the Water Act that we're talking about and this NDAA piece that you're going to speak on, and probably about 100 amendments that we have been able to filter through that we will put before the committee with a recommendation that we make and order some 100 amendments.
Today.
Yes, ma'am. One rule, these two bills, and about 100 amendments therein so that we can get this started and allow your team and our team the opportunity to effectively work through things. Mr. Smith, I know that you'll be consulting, as Chairman Thornberry does with me, on your ideas about the best ways to look at the activities in front of us, and I want you to know we really appreciate your attention to this effort. And Mr. Chairman, you're now welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking member, and members of the committee. I appreciate this opportunity to appear before you again with my partner on this committee, the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Smith, in order to present the fiscal year 2018 National Defense Authorization Act. It was reported by our committee by a vote of 60-1, and as you were discussing the amendments that have been filed so far with the Rules Committee, I would just report to you we had 347 amendments filed in committee consideration, and 116 Democratic-sponsored amendments were adopted, and 115 Republican-sponsored amendments were adopted in the committee process. As I mentioned, we reported it out by a vote of 60-1. That does not mean that everybody or anybody likes every provision in it, but I do think there is widespread agreement in our committee on at least 2 points. One is that we live in a dangerous world, and the second one is an enormous amount of damage has been inflicted on our military because of CRs, sequestration, the whole series of events for which we bear some responsibility. The two primary thrusts of the bill before you today are to begin to rebuild, but also to reform the Pentagon and the military. And as you know, Mr. Chairman, this bill covers a wide range of activities, everything from missile defense, which, by the way, the administration budget request actually cut missile defense from what it is this year at a time when the North Korean threat is growing more ominous day by day. So everything from missile defense to helping military spouses with some of the costs they incur in transferring licenses from one state to another as they are moved about the country. So just a whole series of things from the relatively smaller and personal, but is very important to military families, to the big strategic issues that we face. I don't think it's an exaggeration for me to say that every member of our committee contributed to this product. Whether it was questions, issues they wanted to pursue, or amendments that they offered, or work provisions they worked on. And so I'm proud of what we bring before you. I know it will improve as a result of your work and the work we will do on the floor. I would respectfully request an appropriate rule for a bill of this sort, and the more we can keep amendments focused on the topic of the bill, the better I think Mr. Smith and I will probably like it. Thank you again for giving us the opportunity, and I would yield back and be ready for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smith, we're delighted that you're here. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, I really want to thank Chairman Thornberry for his leadership on the committee. He described the process very well. It was a very bipartisan process, good, robust debate, marking up legislation the way it's supposed to be done through the committee process with the members most knowledgeable on the subject matter. And I think by and large, through that process, they produced a very good product. And I want to give one quick special shout out to the computer system. Something we did this time, we had all the amendments done electronically, and that saved us probably 2 hours of passing out paper. So if you have advice for any other committees, passing out amendments electronically is the way to go, without question. And I agree with the chairman on the threats that we face and on the difficulty that our military has faced over the course of the last 7 years now. CRs, we had one government shutdown. We've had numerous threatened government shutdowns. And what I think a lot of people don't understand, and this is true, obviously, of all discretionary spending, transportation, education, elsewhere. But in DOD, I think it's particularly important because they're providing for the defense of our country. For years, on and off, they have not known what money they could spend on which programs. I vividly remember I had dinner with the then Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, Pete Corelli, back in April of 2011, or March of 2011. We were coming up on our first, April 1st deadline. Government was going to shut down if we didn't continue it, and no one knew what was going to happen. And he was talking over, I forget the number, but he had somewhere in the neighborhood of 190 different programs within the Army. And he had no idea after April 1 what he was going to be able to fund and what he wasn't going to be able to fund. And every day his lawyers gave him a different opinion. We'll play that out over the course of 6 years, and that uncertainty and instability has had a debilitating effect on the military. While meanwhile, we are still fighting in Afghanistan, we're in Iraq and Syria, we're trying to deal with the threat of various terrorist organizations and confronting North Korea, Iran, and Russia. So, I share the chairman's concern that we need to get a regular order in place. We need to get an appropriations bill done. Now, I'm worried, and this is the only concern I will express, and then I'll yield to your questions. I'm worried that we're still not there yet, because this bill has $621 billion in its base, and I think another $75 billion in OCO, $10 billion of which, though it's put in OCO, is admitted to be in base. Complicated, but $696 billion. But that obviously exceeds the budget caps. And as we sit here today, just as we sat in committee 2 weeks ago, we do not have a budget resolution. We have not voted as a House to bust the budget caps. Now, we don't have to do that on the authorizing side, but if we're going to get the appropriations bill done to match this, those budget caps are going to have to be busted for defense. And it's going to be difficult, I think, to get the votes in the House. And then in the Senate, it requires 60 votes, which means that you're going to need some number of Democrats to vote for whatever budget appropriations blueprint is put forward. And not having resolved that issue, as we marked up this bill, it is distinctly possible that, I have to do a little quick math in my head, but I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $72 billion that this bill is over the budget caps. That $72 billion goes away, and we're right back into uncertainty. So unless we resolve the overall budget issue, we're not going to get there. And I will mention that the non-defense discretionary budget matters as well. Even if we want to focus on defense as being more important, I don't necessarily agree with that. I think protection of the country and making sure that we have a strong economy is also important. But even if you want to go there, understand that the budget blueprint that's put forward pluses up defense by $72 billion and cuts non-defense discretionary by $5 billion. Don't know that you're going to get 60 votes in the Senate to do that. And we're right back into the land of uncertainty, which is not good for defense. So I urge all members, not just of this committee, not just of Armed Services, but of the House and the Senate to resolve the budget issue so we can get some predictability going forward. And the last thing I'll point out is that for all of the challenges that we do face, and I think we've outlined them fairly well, we know the list. It's North Korea, Russia, China, Iran, and then the violent extremist groups that come at us from a bunch of different angles. We have more defense needs than we are ever possibly going to have money to meet. So we're going to have to make choices. And I'm still concerned that we're not making those choices. And as of now, whatever it is, July 11th or whatever the date is today, we do not have a national security strategy from the White House. We don't know how they prioritize those threats. And just to give you one example that I discussed with folks, we have a shortage of munitions, primarily missiles. And if we're going to defend against whatever North Korea might want to do or whatever Iran might want to do, having a stockpile of those missiles as a credible deterrent is important. Meanwhile, we've done 3 times as many airstrikes under the Trump administration on a per-day basis, if you will, than we did under the Obama administration in places like Syria and Iraq and Yemen and Somalia. And how does that balance? what choice was made? Was there a strategic calculation made that said, it's just that important, we're going to fire these missiles here, that's going to give us a shortfall over there? It's not enough to say, I'm just going to let the combatant commanders make the decisions, because CENTCOM, that's what they're in charge of. They're in charge of Syria and Iraq. That's what they're going to be focused on. But if they're firing all the missiles, what's the Pacific commander saying about his deterrent capability now? We need a national security strategy, and we need a budget. There is outstanding work done in this bill. A lot of it doesn't have anything to do with money. The chairman mentioned a couple things. Excellent policy provisions, ways to try to make sure that we're taking care of the men and women who serve us, and most importantly, their families. And that's all good, but if the budget numbers get blown up, and we're sitting here in 4 or 5 months, and all of a sudden we got to redo this thing with $72 billion less money, the uncertainty piles on the uncertainty. We do not even, for the first time in my time serving, from the Pentagon, have a 5-year defense plan. They didn't put up what they referred to as a FYDP. And I think the reason for that is they don't have any idea how much money they're going to have. And I get that, but again, planning. How can you plan if you're just doing a 1-year budget plan, and even that budget plan has a range of somewhere in the neighborhood of $72 to $100 billion in terms of what you might have, and that range still exists in July, and October 1st is coming. So the work in this bill, I think, has been outstanding. We have got to resolve the overlying issue of the budget and what money we're going to have to spend. And with that, I look forward to your questions.
I want to thank both of you. The gentleman brought up an issue that has been discussed in this committee a number of times. A number of members have talked about it, and that is not just the strategy, but what is the plan. And I would like to, without making an announcement, let you know, because you're serious about what you said. The young chairman is serious about what he is saying, that discussions have more than begun about the need to make sure we do understand the big picture, that we understand the strategy, that we understand, we get the policy, and those of us that do travel in theater understand those combatant commanders, I believe, have a good handle on their priorities, but still it needs to be communicated with this body. And I would anticipate that we're getting closer to that and that ability. And so I think your push will help us very much. I am going to defer my time and would move to the gentlewoman from Wyoming. The gentlewoman's recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith. It's an honor to serve on the committee. Hi. That's right. I feel closer to you guys, though, than I am on the Armed Services Committee, so it's a treat.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Would you say that again?
On the Armed Services Committee, Mr. Chairman, as you know, those junior members on the committee sit much farther away from our chairman and ranking
See,
member
we treat you
than.
better at the Rules Committee.
Thank you
My
very
point.
much. I
I think the
appreciate
point was
that.
well made. The young chairman got that also.
Thank you. No, but it is an honor to be on the committee. I'm very proud of this product, and I think that the leadership that Chairman Thornberry showed and the bipartisan nature of the product is very important. I want to echo the comments about the Budget Control Act. I think that it is incumbent upon us as a body to recognize, first of all, that we have no more important obligation than providing for the defense of the nation. Nothing else we do in this room, in this building, up here on this hill matters as much as making sure we're securing the nation. And that, in my view, requires both providing adequate resources and it requires repealing the Budget Control Act. We've seen the damage that the BCA has done since it's been in effect, and recognizing that the debt is not being driven by the defense budget, but that our adversaries are developing and fielding capabilities and weapon systems against which we might not be able to defend. And that was brought home yet once again last week with the North Korean ICBM test. So I applaud the work, I applaud the product. I wanted to ask Chairman Thornberry if you could speak a little bit more about the missile defense piece of this. I know that's something that people are very focused on, very concerned about, especially in light of the North Korean test. And you could talk about what we've authorized and how important those pieces are.
Well, I appreciate the gentlelady raising the point and appreciate her and Mr. Burns' contributions as members of our committee as well. As I mentioned, the administration request on missile defense actually went down from the current year. The threats are not going down, the threats are escalating. What we have in the bill before you is an authorization that increases missile defense about $2.3 billion above what the administration asked for. Some of that money goes to buy more interceptors, and this gets back to the point that Mr. Smith was making. As a matter of fact, the media reports today, we had the 14th successful intercept using the THAAD system. However, we have a limited number of interceptors to use with that system as well as other systems. So part of what we're doing is trying to buy more interceptors for the variety of systems so we have more capability, especially in the Pacific, but elsewhere as well. But what we also do is put more money into research. We do not yet have a full range of defenses against ballistic missiles from the launch, mid-course, and terminal phase. And it requires some new technologies. We try to put our foot on the accelerator of research in that vital area. So we try to do a full range. Those threats are not going to go down by anybody's reckoning, and so this bill makes a priority on missile defense.
Thank you. And then Ranking Member Smith, just picking up on that, you know, when we look at sort of where we are today in terms of capabilities vis-a-vis the Russians, the Chinese, you know, one instinct is to sort of say, let's do everything we can to try to catch them, to try to do everything possible to make sure that in areas where we may have fallen behind, that we close the gap. Another way to look at it, though, is that it's going to be crucially important for us to actually leapfrog, for us to think ahead, to look ahead, to focus on research and development into areas that you know, will help us overcome some of their capabilities, not so much in a catch-up perspective. Could you talk about sort of what we see in this bill that looks maybe longer term and looks at new technologies and capabilities that we think need to be developed?
Well, two things. One, I think it's very important to prioritize what capabilities we are trying to counter, and I'll talk more about that later. But in terms of the things that are in the bill that are most focused on countering the threats that we face, and the biggest one is missile defense. I mean, I can't say it any better than Mac just said it. I mean, that's the greatest threat that we now face, and it's a fairly, well, easy is an overstatement, but it's not an impossible technology to get a hold of, as the North Koreans have proven, and it's a great threat. I mean, you have an effective missile, you can take out an aircraft carrier, and the aircraft carrier has been the symbol of our power and our ability to project it. Well, if we can't defend that aircraft carrier, all of a sudden it becomes a $12 billion floating target. So I would say missile defense is one of the most important areas where we can protect ourselves. The other thing that's important in this bill, and this gets sort of into my prioritizing. I mean, you can look at China and say, well, what if China tried to launch all their nuclear missiles at us? Well, what are we in a position to defend ourselves on that? The likelihood of that is very small. So spending an enormous amount of money against that threat doesn't make a lot of sense. We have to prioritize the threats. Now, what North Korea might do, my personal opinion with North Korea is it's all about deterrence. They are developing these weapons for regime survival. Maybe in the back of their head they fantasize about taking over South Korea, but I don't think that's at the top of their list. Top of their list is you can't take us out because we got a nuclear weapon that can hit you. So if we're going to counter that, we have to make sure that we make it clear to them that if they attack us in any way or our allies in any way, they may have a few nuclear weapons, they may have a few ICBMs, we have the ability to obliterate them. So I would say also diplomacy is pretty darn important. Making sure that we communicate our intentions clearly about what we're going to do. That is another way to match capabilities. And I think if we get caught up in an arms race with Russia and China and North Korea and Iran, we got too many adversaries. We can't win that. We've got to make sure that we communicate clearly what our priorities are, and we use that as a deterrent. And the one area where I think we need to step up our efforts, frankly, is in the area of cyber. and counterintelligence and counterespionage, and if there's such a thing as counter misinformation. Because, we can look at Russia's nuclear arsenal and freak out about, well, gosh, we only have this many nuclear weapons. They have that many. Do we have this? Do we have that? We have a pretty solid nuclear stockpile. And one of my concerns is that we're going to spend an enormous amount of money basically refighting the Cold War on nuclear weapons, when in fact what Russia's actually doing is they're undermining our democracy in a much smaller way. They're undermining it through the use of cyber. Certainly they hacked in and tried to affect our election, but they've done it in dozens of others. They've used misinformation campaigns. I said this in the committee. It hasn't actually been confirmed, but there's some evidence that a misinformation campaign from the Russians was part of what started the split between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, playing right into Russia's hands. Those are our best allies right now in trying to fight ISIS. What are we doing to counter that? And this is something the chairman and I have worked on, and I won't bore everybody with the details of Smith-Munt or the hell we took for fixing it, but we did, and I think that's important. So that's what I think we do. What are our adversaries? Okay, we can all sit around and theorize about what they might do. What are they doing? What are they most likely doing? And do we match and exceed their capabilities there? That's where I think the focus needs to be, and I will compliment Congresswoman Stefanik and Congressman Langevin, who are the chair and ranking member of the Emerging Threats Committee. I think they're doing a great job of trying to get us ready for that. It just needs to be matched by broader action across the House and the White House.
Thank you very much, and I share your determination that deterrence is crucial, and I think what we've seen, particularly with North Korea, is frankly Republican and Democrat administrations have relied on diplomacy that was ineffective.
Yeah,
and
they tried, but it didn't work.
Right, and there were consequences to the failure. But we've got to make sure we have both. You've got to have the capability, but you've also got to have the will, and the adversary's got to understand that we have the will to do what's necessary to deliver the kind of response that you've talked about. So again, in closing, I just want to thank you both very much. It's, as I said, I think the very most important thing we're doing up here and our most important constitutional obligation. So I appreciate all of the work and the bipartisan effort on it. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cheney. By the way, you double as a member of Congress and back home, you double Armed Services Committee and Rules Committee, but you also double as a mom. And do you want to introduce your one of your daughters?
Thank you very much, Chairman Sessions. My daughter Elizabeth is here in the audience today, and on her summer break from Colorado College. And as I said to Congressman Byrne, she said there was nothing she wanted to do more this summer than hear the NDAA debate. So I was happy to oblige. No.
And she's lucky enough to be in the
honored
Rules
to
Committee.
let her be here. Thank you.
Well, we're delighted that you're with us as our children come and visit us. It's a difficult task, as everybody knows, to try and double as a parent, double as a congressman, and Mac Thornberry has done this for years very well, and I think you're entitled to have your daughter be a proud part of this. Thank you very much. Mrs. Slaughter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I know you have done a lot of work to get to where we are today, and I must say I'm very impressed that the vote was 60-1. That's pretty remarkable that you pleased everybody. I agree with what Mr. Smith is saying, though, that we can't, there's no way we can absolutely be sure we're going in the right direction. But the fact that what we were trying to do with weaponry, I think, was try to control so much of our adversaries. At the same time, we find to our surprise that we have been undermined by lack of cybersecurity. Whether we'll be able to catch up with that, I don't know. The most graphic illustration of that, I believe that, in my view, probably as little as 10 years ago, if the American public had known that the Russians were undermining us and what they had done, and their interference in the election and other things that they had done, that there would be anger like uncontrollable. And it is stunning to me how little impact that's making on the psyche of America. In fact, I would say for most people out there, people have been talking about it, we never hear from it much. I sometimes get somebody calling the office wondering a little bit about if we're concerned about what the Russians are doing. So we have to leave it in your capable hands there, that what we are going to be doing and the money we're going to be spending. And I agree, Mr. Smith, with what you said about breaking the budget caps and whether or not that will allow us even to pass this bill. But it is a perilous time. And more than anything, I want to be able to try to assure the American people as much as we can that we're on the right road. We need to be on that, for certainly agree with what Ms. Cheney said, but the young people who volunteer to put themselves in the breach for us deserve from us the very best that we can give them. And I want to make sure that we're doing that. So I give you lots of respect for all the work that you've done. This has to be one of the most difficult assignments, and to my view, in the House of Representatives, to put this budget together. I don't have any questions about it. I would have to delve into it a little bit, but from what you've done in the past years, I've certainly understood that both of you have both your heads and your hearts in the right spot. So thank you for your hard work.
If I can make a quick comment on that, and I'll try not to get this into a larger debate, but I think there is a threat that you've been talking about what the Russians have done and how people have reacted to it. We're all aware of North Korea. To some extent, we're aware of certainly what the Russians are doing in the Ukraine, Iran's support for Hezbollah, China's building islands and all of that. There's sort of a broader threat, which is what the Russians are a part of, and that is a threat to basic democratic principles that I think is spreading, and it's like the frog being boiled in water. It's spreading slowly, and I think that's the reason people aren't noticing it.
You know, Ms. Smith, they not only did not believe it in America, but the way it took place in Europe was pretty astounding. And we've got some authoritarian governments over there. They're part of NATO.
Yes.
Which is another thought that we have to do. What happens if someone attacks them? We are obliged to all of a sudden
Well, this is where I'm going, and what I hope we
Yeah.
come up with as an overarching strategy here is that freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to vote, transparent elections. When you look at, I mean, we all, after the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union broke up, we had hopes that Russia would become a representative democracy.
Right.
And you've seen basically it go the other way. I mean, critics are killed in that country. It's a kleptocracy from an economic standpoint.
Terrible mess, yes.
And now they're trying to spread that, even in Poland. You know, we've started to have problems of the suppression of free speech. In Turkey,
Romania.
we've seen it in
Yes.
Romania, but a whole bunch of places. And we have to ask ourselves the question, do we see that as a threat? And I think to many people, I do, absolutely.
Well,
I think
look
we
at
need
some
to
of
make
the
that
leadership
point more
that they've
clearly.
elected, which is
Yes.
purely authoritarian.
In the
And
Philippines,
the fact that
we've got the
these
same
are
problem.
NATO members, I don't know how we're really going to come to grips with that part of it. We haven't even discussed that yet.
I'm just saying that that's what we need to wake up to. Is it seems like an obscure threat, but it's really at the core of what we stand for, both economically and politically.
It was tremendously successful before we really caught on to it. I think we'll manage it in Germany, probably be okay there. And, we're glad the Netherlands, but anyway, we'll talk about it later. But I absolutely agree with you. That was the silent threat that I'm not sure a lot of Americans really care much about even now. I'm sorry about that, but we certainly do need the free press to make sure they're aware of it.
Gentlewoman yields back her time. The gentleman from Louisville, Texas, Dr. Michael Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our two witnesses for obviously the significant amount of work you've placed into this effort and bringing before the Rules Committee today. I do have a question that is not so much related to the bills before us today, but not quite a month ago, there was an accident off the coast of Japan where a missile destroyer was struck by a container ship with the loss of 7 United States sailors. And I guess I was a little bit surprised to have never had any briefing on that. Have you all had a briefing on the Armed Services Committee level?
Not on what the cause of the accident was. I do think there is a very serious investigation by a number of entities to determine what that is. If I could just add one other point, yesterday afternoon, we lost a plane and 16 service members lost their lives in that accident. There will also be an investigation of that. But it gets back to something Ms. Slaughter said. We don't know, I don't know, and I don't want to speculate what those causes were. The ship thing seems very strange to many
It does.
people. But this, what we ask the young men and women who volunteer to do has an inherent amount of danger to it. And my point, which is exactly what Ms. Slaughter said, is we owe them our best. We owe them the best equipment. We owe them the best training to deal with it. And even then, there's no guarantees. But it just reinforces that this is a dangerous business in a dangerous world. And I think our obligation under Article 1, Section 8, is to provide them with the best our country can provide. And when we don't, when we have half the planes that the Navy has that can't fly for maintenance issues, for example, when we see airplane accident rates on the rise across most of the services, as they are, part of that is our responsibility to repair.
And I would just say, add, the training itself is incredibly dangerous. So a lot of the readiness issues that the chairman alluded to, and there are more, contribute to our ability to make sure that that training is as safe as possible, because lives are lost frequently in the training. And I think the readiness shortfalls that we've had have undeniably contributed to that. And that broader subject is something we have been briefed on and have discussed on the Armed Services Committee.
Well, the missile destroyer accident, and Chairman, thank you for mentioning the KC-135 accident yesterday, 15 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman killed in that accident. Correct, training is dangerous. It does raise questions about are these the result of human error, mechanical error, and no, we should not speculate. But at the same time, I guess what I'm asking for is the reassurance that at the committee level, you will receive those reports and look at those reports. And for those of us who are just humble backbenchers in the United States House of Representatives, are we likely to have the ability to look at those reports as well? So that we can reassure our constituents that we did our oversight responsibility into ensuring that our men and women are not endangered by in fact the equipment that they're using?
Yes, is the short answer. I just mentioned that these things take time, and in some ways it seems like they take too much time, but they try to be very thorough, go through everything. Sometimes, obviously, these are classified.
Sure.
And so you run into some restrictions. But I agree with you that I think it's important for us to do our job, that we get to the bottom of the matter. And I hate to keep bringing up issues. We've also had an issue of the safety of the oxygen breathing apparatus with a number of planes. All of these issues are getting an incredible amount of intense priority from us pushing the various services to get to the bottom of the matter. Because as we were just saying, this is dangerous enough as it is. We cannot tolerate any sort of slowness in getting to the bottom of them, getting these problems fixed.
Well, I thank both of our witnesses for being here today. Thank you for the exemplary work you've done on this bill and the fashion that you've worked together. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman is back. It's time. Thank you very much to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr.
Yeah, thank you.
McGovern's
I'll be brief.
recognized.
I want to thank you both for your bipartisan effort. There's lots in this bill that I see that I can agree with. There's some that I don't agree with. It's the same stuff I always have issues with year after year. I worry about the fact that we're involved in these endless wars and we don't spend a lot of time debating them. And we're about to increase our military footprint in Afghanistan, and we're still operating off an AUMF that goes back to 2001. I don't get it why we can't figure this out. And I understand that your committee is not necessarily the committee of primary jurisdiction, but the Foreign Affairs Committee, we don't get a foreign aid bill before here, so there's no opportunity to offer any amendments. I also worry that we rely too much on military options to solve all the world's problems, and I'm not quite sure that they're working, whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq or so many other places in the world. And I'm concerned about the, that we're engaged in a $1.2 trillion nuclear modernization program at a time when I think we ought to be moving in a very different direction. But, I guess I'm in the minority on that. But in any event, I appreciate the work that you guys do, and I'll have a lot more to say. I have some amendments that I'm going to bring to the floor, I hope, if they're made in order by the Rules Committee. If you know anybody in the Rules Committee, you might want to put in a good word for my amendments, because I don't really carry a lot of weight up here anymore. But I look forward to a vigorous debate on the floor. So thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. By the way, I appreciate the gentleman's really polite push, and I was in reference to that earlier when I talked about this administration now being at a place that I believe where they have effectively gathered together their team, State Department, although there's some debate about how many people there,
They don't have enough people.
whether they have enough people, but still,
They
the
can't
time.
lay a bridge, I understand.
But my point is that I believe we're nearing a time where we will be able to get closer at the strategic implications, which will drive the direct answers to what you were speaking about, Mr. McGovern. And I don't think that we should wait. I think we should get to that, and I want to forthrightly get close to that. Yes, ma'am.
We were terribly worried about North Korea, but South Korea doesn't yet have an ambassador. We don't have a working embassy there. That is pretty awful. As a matter of fact, I think that's happening all over the country, world, isn't it?
Mr. Chairman, if I may, on that subject, this is contrary to my best interest to start an argument here, but I think we're not exactly where you described, and that's one of my concerns. When I talk about us not having a national security strategy, I don't know what the numbers are at the Pentagon. I know there are 53 positions that are supposed to be appointed at the Pentagon. I don't think we're in double digits yet in terms of the number, and forget about what the Senate's doing. The names haven't even been sent to the Senate yet.
They haven't nominated.
And the same is true in the State Department. In fact, to amplify Mr. McGovern's point about Afghanistan, while we made the decision to put more troops into Afghanistan, we disbanded the Afghanistan-Pakistan working group in the State Department and have not put any expert in that particular part of the world in place yet. So we're going to throw more troops and more firepower at it and not have that overall plan. And that's what I'm concerned about, and I'll tie this back to the other comment that Mr. McGovern made about the nuclear modernization plan. I mean, let's say for the sake of argument that in an ideal world, we should spend $1.2 trillion to modernize our nuclear weapons program. We don't have enough money to do that and to have the credible deterrent that we want to North Korea and to Russia and to Iran. I mean, on our committee, we constantly have people coming over from the Defense Department basically scaring the living hell out of us about all the awful things in the world that are going to happen. And I haven't done the math yet, but we need a defense budget somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 trillion to be able to counter all of that. That's not going to happen. That's why it's important to begin developing a strategy, and it's important to prioritize as to what the greatest threats are and where we should spend our money. And I think we've done a decent job of that on the committee, of having those discussions. But I think there is a ways to go on the executive at this point in terms of giving us that clarity. And that's part of meeting the obligation that the chairman described so well that we have.
Well, and I agree with that. All I'm simply suggesting to you, notwithstanding that they have not filled these positions, I believe it's incumbent upon them to give us answers. I don't think it does us any good to be the president's now 1/8 through his term. The president needs to get on with their business. They need to get on and they need to advise Congress, and we need to be able to respond. We need to be able to do this. And I'm looking at a member who very graciously over the last few years has been, I think, very kind about this issue, and we need to get there. And that's what I intend for us to do. Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would again, thank both Chairman and the Ranking Member for this. As I think the one on the committee now that actually still is serving in the military, this is, of course, very close to me. I will comment on a few of the things, but I do think the work that is done is appropriate. I think there's some questions that we still need to address as we go forward. One of the things that's not going to catch a lot of attention, but I wanted to raise it now, and it has to do a little bit with a cybersecurity issue, is the underlying language that's in there for the ROTC Cyber Institutes. One of the things that we don't have is a very good pipeline for cyber and our security needs, and I think this is a very good thing. North Georgia College, University of North Georgia, which happens to be my alma mater, is one of 6 senior military colleges that really put forth an effort here, that and combined with languages and other things, which has been very important in getting us into areas in which we've not had before. So I think that is, something that has been very good. I think will continue, and I'm glad to see that. It's not something that's going to catch the headlines on the floor, and I can understand it not being addressed. But when you get into the basics many times of bills, this is like the foundation kind of stuff. These are nobody looks at the foundation. They look at what all of the pretty, accoutrements are everywhere else. But this is something that's very solid for where we're moving forward, and I think that's a good thing. Look, I think there's a lot of discussion here today, and we can discuss AUMF. I have my ideas about that as well. I think the administration owes one. I don't think, frankly, the last administration had a very good one at all. But at a certain point in time, it's an articulated document. At least it shows where we're headed. Other things that I would like to see as we move forward, and I'm very pleased to see in the previous authorizations we've had, is redoing our retirement, redoing the issues of structural need for long-term visibility. But as we said before, and I think, as we move forward in this, a priority issue as we're looking forward to it. And I do a lot of discussion when I go around now, especially when I get to go to bases and stuff, they know that I serve this dual role. It is amazing to me, especially when you talk to senior non-coms or you speak to middle, company grade officers and others, about the realities of living in the reserve force, the guard force, and the active force, and the inequities that are going on there, and the push and pull between active and guard and reserve as far as training, capabilities, depot, service, training, these kind of things. That's our next big level that we're really going to have to look into. I think when you talk about service strength numbers, in-strength numbers, you look at requirements for training, and you also look at civilian populations, which I know is almost the third rail in defense looking because of bases and everything and the civilian populations that are around it. But if we don't start looking at some of that, we're not doing ourselves justice, because I would rather wonder if we could not save, instead of having some arguments about how much more we need to find or add, is repositioning some of the monies that we're spending on some of these areas. And I spoke to the chairman about this. He's been so gracious to talk about this, and we'll continue this. But I think one of the things that I would love to see sometimes, even if you had to do it as a closed hearing, is I know that you bring in the top, the brass, the 4-stars and the colonels and all that come in. I think sometimes what we're finding, I went home one time and was actually talking about an Air Force perspective, and there was a hearing that went on some readiness issues in Depot, and I expressed what I had heard in the committee, and some of the maintenance officers and others that I talked to at that point just started, they just put their hands in their head, and they said, this is, they're not listening to what, they're giving the talking points. And the ones of us who are having to follow it out are missing. This is the next big area for us, is to add you talk about readiness capability, you talk about training perspective. Looking at areas where we have, this balance is something that I want to see, addressed. And I think it's something that has been discussed in our forward projection as far as we go forward and how we project to the world, whether the threat may be. But until we start prioritizing some of these things that are eating up a great deal of our time and effort and money, that could be put to other use, or even expanding the footprint of in-strength, I think we're going to continue to sort of have these problems, because it's almost like and the gentlelady said from Wyoming, the drivers on our budget are our mandatory spending side, which we just basically look at and acknowledge and grieve, and then go on and spend, and then we worry about the other 20 cents of the budget that we don't spend. This is another area I think that we got to look at in the defense side as well, and I'm willing to, to say, hey, here's our ideas. I want to thank you for what you have done in this area. But I think digging below the years of I've made it to this level, but going back now and actually looking at how those are actually functioning is something that would be the next, phase, especially from maintenance and training perspective. When you talk about, planes not being able to fly, I serve a reserve unit, and I go back and forth on this C-130 unit that's getting upgraded as they go, but they're putting them in the air. and they're using what they have, they find what they have, they're making it work, and then they go to other places. And so I think there's a management issue that has to be addressed here at some point as well. It just doesn't get that bad overnight with the money being the only problem. I think there's some other issues that have to be addressed. So with that, I think it's something that's close to my heart. I just got off drill this past weekend, did some time, volunteer time, so it's to get points. But those are the kind of things that you're seeing on an everyday basis when you talk to members. Your work is appreciated, and it is something I think as we move forward, that's our next big level, and I hope we'll see that in many ways. But I just want to thank you for what you're doing. We look forward to the rest. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much. The gentleman from Florida, Judge
Thank you
Hastings.
very much, Mr.
Yes, sir.
Chairman. I echo the sentiments of Mr. Collins in thanking the chairman and ranking member of this committee. All of us know the rather extraordinary work that they do along with the full committee under difficult and immediate restrictions. And one that concerns me, and I ask either or both of you, what will be the consequences of not extending the New START treaty? And whether or not that depends on whether Russia is in compliance with the INF. I never did understand how I got invited
Yes, ma'am.
to the START talks that were taking place, and somehow or another Jimmy Carter's people had me to go there. I still don't know what I heard or how I heard it, but I do recall that it was during the Cold War. So my concern is if we don't do the New START treaty, then we don't have access to Russia's information that START allowed for inspection. So if there's a question there, if either of you would answer me your views regarding the limitations in this measure with reference to the New START treaty. Mr. Chairman?
Ms. Hastings, I'd just say briefly, a treaty is only beneficial if it's enforced. And I think there is concern about Russian violations of treaties. I believe the provision we have in the bill basically says the New START treaty shall not be extended if our judgment is the Russians are in violation of it.
INF.
And so there's a number of treaty issues with the Russians right now. I think personally we've got to be more serious about holding their feet to the fire or taking consequences for that. Again, having names on a piece of paper doesn't really do very much if it's not being followed and enforced.
And I would agree with the chairman. I would simply add, one odd thing is, as concerned as I am about Russia and as bad as our relations, I think, are now with Russia, one of the things I think we need to get back to, I mean, in some ways it's even worse than the Cold War, because at least for the last 20 years of the Cold War, we were in communication with them, and certainly President Reagan negotiated, a number of treaties as a way to, stop us from killing ourselves with an arms race. So I'd like to get back to the point where we could sit down at the table with the Russians and talk about reasonable arms control treaties, particularly when you're talking about nuclear weapons. So, as much as I'm concerned about Russia and as much as I want us to counter what they're doing, the world's going to be a better place if the two largest nuclear powers can get back to the point where they can have those discussions about how to, sensibly contain those weapons. So I realize things are ever so slightly complicated at the moment where Russia is concerned, but that's a discussion that we need to get back to.
All right. That's all from me, Mr. Chairman.
Judge, thank you very much. The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from the Armed Services Committee and Rules Committee, Mr. Burns, recognized.
Thank you. And I want to thank both of you for your leadership. In addition to having that innovation with the amendments on the computer, we actually finished before midnight, which with over 300 different amendments offered, and I think we adopted over 200 of them, we went from 10 o'clock in the morning to 1 minute before midnight and got through all of that, even having to take breaks for votes. So it's a pretty remarkable process that is the culmination of months and months of hard work, and I appreciate both of you for what you do. I have a couple of statistics I got my staff to get for me, and I thought it'd be helpful to everybody. In my judgment, this is the most important thing Congress does, is making the American people safe. Yet, even with this increase in the FY18 National Defense Authorization Act, we're still only authorizing 16.8% of total federal outlays for defending America, 16.8%. And it's only 3.4% of projected gross domestic product for the United States. If you go back 30 years, we really only had to worry about Russia 30 years ago. Didn't have to worry about China militarily or Iran, even though Iran was an adversary, they weren't a military threat. We certainly didn't have ISIS or Al-Qaeda. North Korea wasn't a military threat. China wasn't a military threat. Back then, the FY88 NDAA was 27% of total federal outlays and 5.2% of GDP. So with all these new threats, we're actually still spending less as a percent of federal outlays and less as a percent of GDP than we were. We really only had one threat. Now, the Soviet Union was a big threat. But still, if you add everything together, I would say, and I don't think you would disagree with me, we face a more complex set of threats now than we did then. So I'm pleased that we've made the increases that we've made in here, but I think we have to understand that we're still not, as a percentage of everything else we're doing around here, we're still not anywhere near where we were 30 years ago. I think, Mr. Smith, your point is very important, that we're going to have to deal with the issues you raised at some point during the course of this year. Ms. Cheney and I completely agree that it's time to bust the caps. Now, I'm not speaking for anybody else, but I think there's some other people on our committee that agree with that. Whatever the reason was for adopting that several years ago, and I wasn't here, and I'm certainly not critical of the reason it was done, it hadn't worked. And we need to own up to that and do our job and make our decisions without having some artificial instrument to get us to make those priority decisions that Mr. Smith alluded to. And the gentleman from Massachusetts has brought up the issue of the AUMF several times. I completely agree with him that we need a new AUMF, maybe more than one AUMF. If anything, the events of the last several months should tell us that we need one now more than ever. I know there was an effort to try to push that issue in the Appropriations Committee. Probably not the right place, the right way to do it, but certainly a shot across the bow. I don't fully understand why the jurisdiction for this, for an authorization for the use of military force, is not in the Armed Services Committee, but it's not, and I accept that. So hopefully the committee of jurisdiction will take one or more of the vehicles. I'm the co-sponsor for one, you've got one, I know, and bring something to us so that we can at least have a debate on it.
Well, will the gentleman yield?
Sure.
So my amendment is actually very, very simple, and it doesn't necessarily indicate that an AUMF has to be written by the Armed Services Committee. It basically says that before we expand our military footprint, that we ought to have an AUMF. I don't care who does it. Rules Committee can do it. But the bottom line is, I think we're up to here with excuses as to why we haven't acted. And quite frankly, it's an insult to the men and women who are serving overseas that we haven't even had the opportunity to have a substantial debate about it on the floor. And I'm just saying that Congress ought to stop making excuses and do its job. And so I don't know any other vehicle that's coming through here where we can attach such an amendment. But all it says is basically that we have to have one. And so it doesn't have to be written by the Armed Services Committee. It could be written by the Committee of Jurisdiction or a combination, or the Rules Committee can write it. But we ought to do it. I thank the gentleman.
I appreciate the gentleman's continued and persistent advocacy for this. I agree with him. I don't know the best vehicle for doing it myself, but we need to do it, however the best vehicle is. I did want to say something. I'm sorry, Ms. Slaughter here. She was referring to, I don't think she meant to say it the way she said it about either a non-working or non-functioning embassy in South Korea. I've been to South Korea twice the last several months. We have a very high-functioning embassy there with a very professional charge d'affaires who's doing an excellent job. I think the more important point is that it's a signal to people in that region that you have an actually appointed ambassador there. And so I hope the administration will prioritize it for that reason, for no other. The question I wanted to ask that I sometimes doesn't get addressed enough, I know you two address it a lot, there's also in this bill a lot of reforms at the Pentagon. And some of our colleagues are saying, you know, there's all these things the Pentagon is doing or not doing that is not the most efficient or effective way to spend money. So do you mind just kind of giving us a summary of what we do in this bill and what we've done in prior NDAAs to try to get the reforms a lot of people want at the Pentagon?
Well, I appreciate, Mr. Byrne, the opportunity to talk a little. The question I get most often is, when is the Pentagon going to be audited? And the short answer is fiscal year 2018. It is in law. It will be audited. And as you remember, when the new comptroller testified before us a month ago, he said that will go forward no matter what. So there are changes occurring at the Pentagon. Each of the last 2 years, we have had substantial packages of acquisition reform. Mr. Collins mentioned a few minutes ago some of the other reforms of the retirement system, of the TRICARE, and other things. But we've had acquisition reform each of the last 2 years, and we have another package of acquisition reforms in this bill before you. Among the other things are a provision that allows, does not require, but allows the Pentagon to buy commercial off-the-shelf items online through portals like Amazon, Walmart, Staples, Grainger. They can go find the best price and buy things that are commercial. They can't, you know, you can't buy a tank online.
I know, I've looked, actually, on Amazon. Amazon Prime's great, but they're not there yet, so maybe someday.
So to try to not only speed it up, but get a better price, because there have been studies by the GSA that have found that using the GSA schedule, you pay more than the commercial price for such items. We try to bring in commercial auditors to do some of the audit work of contracts. We try to make sure that the Pentagon considers maintenance costs and intellectual property at the beginning of a program, not after it's well underway. So there are a number of changes to try to get more value for the taxpayers and to get capability into the hands of the warfighters faster, which, back to what we've been talking about today, seems to me to be the highest priority.
And I just quickly comment on building off some of the comments others have made. You can talk about how much money the Pentagon spends and the strategy and all of that, but making sure what they spend smarter is enormously important, because I think everyone would agree that there's been a ton of wasteful expenditures, and I compliment the chairman for really trying to dive into that. Now, it's not an easy problem. I mean, when you're spending $700 billion, and you have so many people in the world's largest bureaucracy, it's not going to be easy, but I think we are making improvements on that. And the other piece of it is something I was going to say to Mr. Collins' comments earlier. We need to more often ask the question, what are we spending money on at DOD that we shouldn't be spending money on? I've asked that question. They typically don't answer it. That's not helpful. So while we're trying to prioritize, when we have all these things that we know we desperately need, we need to spend money smarter, and we also need to stop spending money on things that aren't advancing our interests. And I would mention the BRAC issue as one example, not to start a debate and an argument there. But giving the Pentagon greater flexibility in terms of where they place their facilities could also potentially save us money. So we in this bill, and I think the chairman has been a great leader on this, even before he was chairman, on acquisition reform, on trying to get the most out of the money we spend in the Pentagon. But we still got a lot of work to do.
Well, I thank the gentleman. I thank both of you for your leadership. I think everybody on this committee can see the incredible professionalism that both of these men bring to their positions. And I will say this, this is my fourth year on that committee, professionalism that everybody on the committee brings to it in every way. And the idea that we could come out of all of that with one dissenting vote is just absolutely remarkable. So I'm proud of the work that we did in that committee. I think this is a great bill, and I know that there are twists and turns as we go through this to a final bill that goes to the president, but I know that we've made the first start, and I'm proud that this is the first start, and I hope people in the House will see it as we do and get behind it and support it. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much. I do not see Mr. Pols right now, but we'll move on. There he is. The gentleman, Mr. Pulse, is recognized.
Thank you. I was just going to ask whether you're both supportive of the traditional, a rule that would allow the traditional prerogative of members on both sides of the aisle to debate and vote on a number of different amendments from the ideas that they have.
Absolutely. No, I think it's one of the great things about this committee, and this has come up already. Sir, we have 62 members on the committee? That's one of the other things. We're talking about how long it takes, and I do admire the efficiency of the Rules Committee, but you have a few fewer members than Mr. Thornberry has to deal with. So we have 62 members, and those members contribute a lot, but both the chairman and I also always emphasize every single member of the Congress ought to have a say in what goes into this bill. So I think a robust process, and from what I understand, we have one coming. So I agree with you, and I think we should absolutely do that.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned maybe before you were here, Mr. Polis, we had 347 amendments filed in committee consideration, and 275 were offered. Of those adopted, 116 were Democratic-sponsored amendments, 115 were Republican-sponsored amendments. I noticed that last year, the Rules Committee made in order 181 amendments, and I've been warned that we may have more this year.
It's very important to beat last year.
Well, maybe we could turn that trajectory at some point, but we've had more amendments filed, and so making more in order, I understand. But Mr. Smith and I will work together to work our way through whatever the Rules Committee deems it's appropriate for us to work through.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. We will not deem anything. We will provide a vote for it. But I do know what the gentleman meant with the comment. By the way, I'd like to go, it's a little bit late in saying this, but part of the documents we've been provided, which is the actual bill as opposed to the report, among other things, page 464, matters related to Syria, Iraq, and Iran, a report on the United States strategy for Syria. In general, not later than February 1st, 2018, the Secretary of Defense, in coordination with the Secretary of State, shall submit to the appropriate congressional committees a report that describes the strategy of the United States in Syria. It's important to note that we have done this previously with a prior administration. I don't know that we received the best thinking, but we received a report. I think it's important, all the things that the gentleman, Mr. McGovern's talked about, I think it's important for Congress equally to work with the administration such that they get our best thinking also. And I would hope that members that hear and see this as they read the bill, as they read the instruments that have been provided by the committee, that they'll see opportunities for them to become involved in this process. Thank you very much. The gentleman, Mr. Newhouse, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think someone's already mentioned, but I didn't want to let my testimony go without mentioning the tanker that went down in Mississippi yesterday and the lives that were lost. So, if that's
16 service members.
It's hard to talk about defense appropriations without mentioning that. But I wanted to compliment both gentlemen, Mr. Smith, Mr. Thornberry, certainly two members of Congress that no matter which side of the aisle you're on, you look up to for their expertise and their knowledge about this particularly important subject. One of the, I think has been said, one of the primary responsibilities of Congress. So thank you very much for all the hard work that you and your committee put into this. And certainly the result of a, was it 60-1 vote on the legislation speaks very highly of the amount of work that you guys have put into that. That doesn't happen by accident. So you've done well in representing the interests of the whole Congress, and I appreciate that very much. I did want to just point out a couple things. One, as you know, the Hanford Nuclear Works is in the state of Washington. Certainly Mr. Smith knows that very well. And I wanted to acknowledge my thankfulness that you've been able to see fit to help our federal government fulfill its legal and moral obligation to make sure that the defense nuclear waste sites, not just at Hanford, but around the country, are addressed, and that we continue to make sure that that important cleanup work continues. It's important not just for my district and state, but for the whole country that we continue that work. And it's not easy, it's not sexy, you're not building something that's going to be shiny and new and is going to roll out the door and everybody's going to ooh and ah it, but it's important, important work, so thank you very much for that. I was going to talk a little bit about some of the things that Mr. Byrne brought up, about the accountability and acquisition process, the auditing issues that I can almost channel Mr. Conaway and some of the things that he brings up at almost every opportunity. But I guess just in listening to some of the things that you've described that will be happening at the Pentagon makes me feel more comfortable. On one hand, we're appropriating more money. On the other hand, we're looking for some accountability, essentially. And I'm glad that those two things are moving forward. It's essential that they do. And so I don't know if there's any more that you'd like to talk about, Mr. Chairman or Mr. Ranking Member, about that. You appreciated the opportunity to get a word in with Mr. Byrne, and just to give you the opportunity, if you could, to talk more about those things.
Well, Mr. Newhouse, the only other thing I want to mention, because you mentioned Mr. Conaway, a few years ago, Chairman Conaway and I believe it was Rob Andrews of New Jersey worked together on a task force on this audit issue. And we, the Congress, put into law certain requirements. And one of the things that Mr. Conaway has insisted is that we don't change the goalpost, but we hold their feet to the fire, if I can mix metaphors in one sentence. And we've tried to do that. And so, as a result, fiscal year 18, the year we're talking about, the Pentagon spending will be audited. And that's the only way we're going to find out for sure where the problems are, and then we'll try to fix those problems and do it again and do it again until we have more visibility.
Yeah. Mr. Smith, any comment? Yep. Okay. Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate the efforts. I look forward to working with both of you and the entire committee on those efforts, and I think Secretary Mattis appreciates it as well, to make, like you said, to make sure that we get the funding where it needs to be. And so look forward to the bill on the floor, and appreciate, again, the hard work. Like I said, this comes as no accident for these kinds of votes to come out of committee, and I appreciate very much your hard work. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Yes, distinguished gentleman yields back his time. Thank you for the questioning. Mr. Buck does not seek time. Thank you very much. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Yeah, I just want to bring this up because I get the sense from when you were speaking earlier and referring to my amendment that maybe there was an inclination not to make an order. I just want to be clear that this amendment is actually different than previous years. So this is not about, we should be doing an AUMF. I don't care who does it, but that's not what my amendment does. I just wanted, for the record, because it is germane to this bill. It says, in the event that the United States Armed Forces remain deployed in Afghanistan after September 30th, 2017, and that the President, in consultation with the Secretary of Defense, increases the number of United States Armed Forces deployed in Afghanistan beyond levels established as of September 30th, 2017, the President shall submit to Congress a determination describing the purpose and expected duration of such increased deployments and the projected number of total troops deployed. And then congressional action not later than 30 days following the receipt of the President's determination under subsection A, Congress shall enact a joint resolution to disapprove of the content of the President's determination. If such joint resolution is enacted into law, the President is directed not to increase the level of troops in Afghanistan beyond the troop levels deployed as of September 30th, 2017. So I guess in anticipation that we were going to have the same old excuse that can't do anything on this because this is not the committee of jurisdiction, this amendment is written actually very differently, and it is germane to the underlying bill. So I hope that that it will be made in order because I think it gives us an opportunity to at least have a discussion about whether increasing our military footprint in Afghanistan is the right thing to do, and maybe some discussion of what our policy is in Afghanistan. I thank the gentleman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much. I would note that in my time that I would yield myself, I want to thank both of you for the hard work. I note on page 23 of the report, Littoral Combat Ship Capacity Enhancements. And I appreciate your looking at this. I've been spending a good bit of time not only to understand the importance of the Littoral Combat Ship, but the success I believe that it provides to the fleet as they meet evolving threats. And I would like to thank the gentleman, Mr. Byrne, for his continued work on that I have been found myself better prepared for. Secondly, on page 152, a matter which I have been engaged in now for 15 years, Section 703, provision of hyperbaric oxygen therapy for certain members of the armed forces. Notwithstanding that I need to learn more about this, I think that this prescribes in law the ability that a physician would have that ability to prescribe as they saw necessary and that has been a long-standing issue with me and my fights that I have had, as the young chairman knows. Secondly, page 233, under strategic programs, cyber and intelligence matters, an overview on the National Security Space Organization. I had a chance to speak with Chairman Thornberry about certain parts of this. I would go to page 233, the third paragraph. The committee is concerned that our posture to address this shift is inadequate in talking about space. As noted by the commander of U.S. Strategic Command, the space enterprise is not resilient enough to successfully prosecute or even survive a high-end conflict which extends into space. And I would thank both of you for your attention to that matter. I want to thank both of you for being here. I would like to acknowledge, if I can, one thing. Chairman Thornberry had a chance to meet a young man, Daniel Crenshaw, from my office, who just arrived on Monday. Mr. Crenshaw is a former Navy SEAL. He spent 10 years in service as a Navy SEAL. He's a graduate of Tufts University as a minor in mathematics, and is a very smart young man. He's just graduated from the Kennedy School, receiving his master's, and has reported for duty in my office. And Dan, I want to thank you very much. I'm sorry, it's physics, not mathematics, that you majored in. I did not mean to demean those physics professors that you had at Tufts. But I want to acknowledge, Mr. Crenshaw, that this committee, on a Republican and Democrat basis, for years have been concerned about the young men and young women, including Navy SEALs and your colleagues in the United States military. And I want you to know that many of the discussions that take place are done on a basis of Mr. Smith and Mr. Thornberry being a part of these discussions. But we thank you for your service. Mr. Crenshaw was severely injured in his service to this great nation and has retired therein with those frailties in his life. But we thank you for your service, Mr. Crenshaw. Thank you. Okay, this finishes this part of the hearing, and I want to thank both of you for taking time to be here. As always, we have our awesome stenographer here, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Smith. Anything you brought in writing would help her as she moves through the finalizing the transcript for today. Thank you very much. Okay, this is the end of, as I described earlier, H.R. 2810, where we were going to segment the NDAA into two sections. The first section would be the testimony from the committee chairman, the ranking member, and then the fulfillment of some agreement that we have for amendments that the committee, we believe, can resolve this evening to begin that process, some 100 amendments to begin general debate. However, also included in that rule, the gentleman, former member of the Rules Committee, the young chairman from certainly the Natural Resources Committee was seeking our attention, and so I would ask that the chairman now come to be a part of his panel. I think Mr. Huffman is here. The gentleman from California would join the chairman. We're delighted that both of you are here. We want to thank you for your service on another very difficult issue that faces not just the West, but this Congress. Without objection, anything you have in writing will be entered the record. The chairman from Utah is recognized.
Well, thank you, and I hope you spend more time on the NDAA than you do on ours. So I do have a statement for the record that will present a couple of things I'd like to emphasize in it. We are talking about H.R. 23, which is the GROW Act, which talks about one of the precious commodities that we have in the West, and that's simply its water. So for multiple years, the West has experienced drought-like conditions, and now, there is one sentence that I'll give you that I have to object to right here. It was written by some of my staffers who do not necessarily live in the West. It says, while California and the West were blessed earlier this year with water. Now, for those of you who live back in the East and the South, when you are blessed with water, you get rain. For those of us who live in the Intermountain West, when we are blessed with water, it is snow, which I have to shovel from my driveway every day that it snows. So when you think that we are being blessed with the water, if you can bless it up in the mountains and leave it off my driveway, I'd be happy, because basically when it melts on my driveway, it goes in the aquifer and goes to the Great Salt Lake, and it's totally useless to anybody. So that's what we're talking about, being blessed. But I do want you to know that though there may not be a drought specifically this year, that much of the problems that we have been exacerbated by man-made issues that are there, and this bill is an attempt to solve the problem of the future, which means when it's going to snow or rain, you got to store it so you can use it later on. That's the bottom line, and that's the very purpose of this, as well as other bills that have been passed before you in the past. Not long ago in the West, there were many areas that were rationing water, while decisions that were made at the federal level were putting hundreds of thousands of acre-feet of water into the Pacific Ocean. What we're talking about with this bill is trying to reprioritize ourselves, so what we do is to store the water before it gets there. If you store it, there's a wonderful place of recreating. There's the opportunity of irrigating land so that you can eat, and there's the opportunity of drinking something other than a Coke product. All of those have to be there, but it only happens if we store. Now, what this bill does is obviously go protect privately held water rights. It reforms the Bureau of Reclamation. Some of this was elements of bills that have been passed on a bipartisan basis already that we've reintroduced together into this one. 23 fixes the broken regulatory system that brings water infrastructure into the 21st century. Its basic goal is to put people above ideology, and making sure that what we do that. If we do nothing, to do nothing is just plain stupid. So I'm asking this committee to take this bill. Officially, I'm asking for a structured rule, although if it's a closed rule, it wouldn't hurt my feelings, because we've gone through this before, not only in the committee, but also on the floor many times. But I'm also going to ask the committee print 23, the print of 23 be made in order, considered read. And obviously, I'm supposed to ask you to have the debate divided evenly, but if you want to give us more time, it wouldn't hurt my feelings at all. With that, I go back.
I thank the gentleman very much. Mr. Huffman, welcome to the Rules Committee. I know the gentleman's been here for some period of time. I hope he gained some bit of knowledge. But there are important things that we do up here, and yours is a very important issue, and the gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is good to be back before you. I wish it were under happier circumstances, because unfortunately we are considering a bill that would do enormous harm to West Coast fisheries, to tribal rights. It would undermine state law. It attempts to micromanage the most complex water system in the world in order to benefit a select few special interests, and it would do great harm in my district and beyond. Given all of these considerations, I respectfully request an open rule so that we can minimize the damage of this bill on the floor. That need for an open rule, I think, is underscored also by the process that's been followed on this bill. Hasn't received a hearing in committee where witnesses could actually testify on its effects and on its flaws. we are about to vote on a bill that hasn't gone through the markup process, where the Committee of Jurisdiction could debate and offer amendments to improve it. And the fact that we're about to vote on a bill with several provisions that no one's ever seen before last Wednesday, aside from a small group of Republican offices, lobbyists, and others who've been working on it, is another reason why this committee, I hope, will grant an open rule. We've talked about the allocation of California's water in past Congresses, of course, but that is not a reason to skip regular order and deny members an open deliberative process in this Congress. And in this respect, the process for this bill does remind me of the Trump care process in the House. Since the majority seems to already know what they want to do, where they want to go, there appears to be no need for hearings, markups, or consultation with the affected people, businesses, and stakeholders. This closed-door process not only ignores the changing conditions of drought in California and how the state has already been adapting to meet water conservation needs, but it also ignores all of the California water provisions that were included, albeit at the last minute, last year, in a bill known as the WIN Act, which is now Public Law 114-322. There's been no discussion about how the provisions of this bill that overlap with enacted law will be reconciled should it become law, and nor have there been any hearings so that the Natural Resources Committee could ask the Trump administration how they're implementing the WIN Act. This is legislating blind. As currently written, this bill eliminates existing fishery protections, which could put many of California's native fisheries and thousands of jobs that depend on them on a path to extinction. That means that this bill is more than just a California problem. Not only would it harm tribes, fishermen, and businesses in my district and across California, but Oregon and Washington will face the consequences as well. There's a UC Davis report earlier this year that found if present trends continue, 74% of California's native salmon, steelhead, and trout species are likely to be extinct in 100 years, and 45% could be extinct in 50 years. This bill would hasten that trajectory toward extinction, harming the fishing industry and all of the jobs that depend on it. And fishing jobs matter. Despite the failure to hold a committee hearing on this bill in the Congress, we have heard about fishermen who are really struggling to pay mortgages. Boats are being scrapped because their owners can't pay mooring fees. Homes are being repossessed. People are hurting. We've heard about the struggles of small business owners running restaurants, hotels, and other retail and service businesses. And we've heard about the impacts on tribal rights, which also matter. The Hoopa Valley tribe, for example, in my district, and others in Indian country have spoken about the danger this bill poses to tribal fisheries and tribal water, fishing, property, and other rights. I want to share an account of the impact of the declining salmon fishery on my constituents. Earlier this year, the Yurok tribe in my district closed down their salmon fishery for the second year in a row. The tribe is in, quote, crisis mode. For this tribe, the Klamath River and its salmon run is their grocery store, it's their church, it's their main highway, it's their lifeline. The fisheries crash that they're facing is unprecedented, and the impacts are devastating, not only economically, but emotionally. Last year, the Yurok tribe declared an emergency after 7 young tribal members committed suicide over an 18-month span. The suicide rate for this reservation is 14 times the national average. H.R. 23 would prevent the Bureau of Reclamation from making water releases necessary to combat fish diseases and prevent future fish kills on this important fishery, the Klamath River. It writes into law a legal conclusion favoring the Westlands Water District and other special interests that have been unable to get their way in court, and so they've come here. Earlier this year, a panel of 3 Ninth Circuit judges upheld the ability of the Bureau to release Trinity River water into the lower Klamath and avoid a fish kill. But who cares what courts say when your connected lobbyists and friends in Washington can seize the water from North Coast tribes and fishing communities through an act of Congress? This bill also includes many provisions that explicitly preempt longstanding state law. And because these preemptions violate state sovereignty, they at the very least deserve to be debated through an open amendment process. Just a few examples. Section 108D of the bill begins with the words, and I quote, "California law is preempted," on page 21, paragraph 3. That section goes on to remove state protections for certain fisheries. Section 113 of this bill preempts a century-old California law in order to block the restoration of California's second longest river and that river's native salmon runs. Section 108 of this bill tells the state of California that it's barred from managing the state's water in a way that could, quote, protect, enhance, or restore any public trust value. In other words, the broader public interest cannot be considered by the state of California when it's managing its own water. These are radical provisions that would drastically alter a century of federal deference to state water law. If the supporters of these provisions believe such extraordinary measures are necessary, they should be willing to hold committee hearings and explain to the state of California why they believe it's appropriate to override state law. Now, despite what this bill suggests, Mr. Chairman, we actually could be working together to address water supply challenges without violating tribal trust responsibilities, without flouting state law. Congress could be supporting a diversity of modern water technologies like reuse, like desalination, water use efficiency, stormwater capture, groundwater storage, and remediation. Local water districts have been asking Congress to do something to prevent the billions of gallons of water lost each year simply because of aging and inefficient infrastructure. They've asked for Congress to help capture billions of gallons of water that could be reused for agriculture, industry, and municipal use. This bill as currently drafted doesn't do anything to resolve any of those issues. My hope, though, is that we can begin to work together on real solutions that can generate more water and more water supply reliability for everyone instead of picking winners and losers. The Reclamation Commissioner for former President George W. Bush put it very well. He described the water that we could tap through reuse as the next great river of the American West. Unfortunately, this bill doesn't offer any solutions like that. But again, if we can move past this unfortunate bill and start working together, there's a lot that we can do. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, sounds like he's for status quo.
Yeah, unfortunately. Actually, much of the dire predictions that Mr. Huffman was basing his discussion on, if you were listening carefully, was based on the premise that his verbs were all in a subjunctive case, that if A happened, then B could happen. I reject the idea that if A has to happen. So B may or may not happen, but the chances of that are minimal. To be very honest, this bill has been heard before. We have had votes in the House and for the last 5 years on most of these provisions. They have been reshuffled and come back again in the form. That means there have been 17 different hearings we have had on the provisions of this bill in the past, which is one of the reasons why we did not think it was necessary to have to go through another formal hearing to hear the same comments again and have the same vote again as we have had on 17 different occasions and on 4 bills that have the floor. Much of this bill, some parts of this bill have already been incorporated from a bill that's already passed the floor with opposition again, but it passed on a bipartisan vote. So I think what we're doing here is coming up with another effort to try and look at what we're dealing with. Specifically, this bill does protect water rights that are superior water rights from the areas. It does specifically prohibit or say that nothing in this bill preempts any existing obligations with the Central Valley Project. It specifically invokes protections of state water rights against infringement by any bureaucracy, whether that bureaucracy is federal, state, or local. So it does have those elements in there. We have been down this path before. This is not a new dance, but it is one of the reasons that we are doing this. The provisions of this bill have had hearings. They have had debates. They will have another one on the floor, I'm sure, as we need to move on again. But the bottom line is still, if we don't do this, we're still doing nothing. Nothing to provide a new way of going into the next century to provide storage. That is the solution. And once again, I don't want people to get consumed with this being a California water bill, even though that's what all the headlines will say. This bill affects all of us in the West in our ability to actually produce new storage abilities and to have modernization of the Bureau of Reclamation and some of the regulatory practices. It is important for me in Utah. It's important for those who will be speaking about it who live in Colorado and in Arizona, as well as in California. But once again, the primary element is this bill puts people above the ideology, and it says that what we have to do is store for the future so that we can have it when the droughts reoccur. And like I say, this is not new. We've gone through this before. We may do it again. But hopefully this process is the right way to go to actually make progress as we move in the future.
Thank you very much. Chairman Cole. Gentleman does not seek time. Mr. McGovern.
Yeah, no, I find it amusing, the Republicans' new way you look at how we should proceed on legislation. If a previous Congress did a hearing or did a markup, then it counts for any Congress in the future. We have 57 new members in this Congress. I think they have a right to be able to be exposed to hearings in regular order. But, so I think this is, and I agree with Mr. Huffman, I don't think this is a very good bill. But having said that, let's have an open rule and let's do something radical. Let's deliberate. Let's have this place actually debate something and have regular order and have members be able to offer varying points of view, and I will support an open rule. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, I've been advised we have about 2 minutes left in the vote. We're going to ask that both of you please come back after the last vote. We believe that'll be around 7:15.
Are you sure they're in there?
Oh, we do. I'm sorry, that's not what the note said. Thank you very much. So what is the status, Mr. Hubbard? About 200 not voted. Oh, 200 not voted.
Are you sure you need other questions before you want us to
Gentleman
come
yielded
back?
4 hours. Thank you very much. The gentleman from Georgia does not seek time. The gentleman from Georgia does not seek time. The gentleman from Florida.
Unanimous consent to include in the record a letter from Governor Brown of California opposed.
Without objection, we'll enter that into the record. Thank you, sir. Anything further, sir?
No.
Thank you very much. Mr. Polis? Gentleman does not seek time. Is there any other member of the committee that would seek time? Well, we got lucky. Thank you very much. We appreciate both of you being here. Couple minutes left. I know you'll want to head down to vote, but please know that anything that you brought in writing, our awesome stenographer would appreciate receiving that to aid her as she develops the record for the hearing today. Okay. Is there any other member that would seek to give testimony for the HR? Kevin, I'm lost. Thank you very much for HR 23. HR 23, any other member that would seek time? Seeing none, this will now close the hearing portion. And now what we're going to do is to recess until after the last vote. The gentleman does not need to come back, nor does the young chairman. We will go ahead and just get our work done. And yes, it is a happy day. So, subject to the last vote that we anticipate will be at 7:15, will be subject to the call of the chair. Rules Committee to come to order, and thank you very much. We've now completed votes on the floor for the day, and we'll move forward. We've had an opportunity tonight to take testimony, H.R. 2810, National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018, H.R. 23, Gaining Responsibility on Water Act of 2017. Chair will now be in receipt of a motion from the gentleman from Louisville, Texas, Dr. Michael Burgess.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 2810, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018, a structured rule. The rule provides for 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and the ranking minority member on the Committee of Armed Services. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of the Rules Committee print 115-23, modified by the amendment printed in Part A of the report, Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. Section 2 of the rule makes in order only those further amendments printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report and amendments in block described in Section 3 of the rule. Provides that the amendments printed in Part B of the report may be offered only in the order printed in the report and may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and opponent, and they shall not be subject to amendment and shall not be subject to demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part B of the report or against amendments in block described in Section 3 of the report. Section 3 of the rule permits the chairman of the Committee on Armed Services or his designee may offer amendments in block consisting of amendments printed in Part B of the report and not earlier disposed of. Amendments in block shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for 20 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chairman and ranking minority member of the Committee on Armed Services or their designees, shall not be subject to amendment and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. Section 4 of the rule provides no further consideration of the bill shall be in order except pursuant to a subsequent order of the House. Section 5 of the rule provides for consideration of H.R. 23, Gaining Responsibility on Water Act of 2017, under a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member on the Committee on Natural Resources. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule makes in order as original text for the purpose of amendment and amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the rules text, the text of the Rules Committee print 1115-24, and provides that it shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against the amendment in the nature of a substitute. The rule makes in order only those further amendments printed in Part C of the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment and shall not be subject to a demand for a division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part C of the report. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
I thank the gentleman from Louisville, Texas. You've now heard the motion from the gentleman. Is there amendment or discussion to that?
Chair,
Ma'am, gentlewoman's recognized.
on Section 4, which I gather we just finished this rule with, wasn't that also applying to that, the last thing that was read? Okay, all right. We you know, I think we've all commented on the fact that this bill passed 60-1, which meant that that was probably as strong bipartisan action as we've had here in a very long time. But you're rewriting the bill now to take out a provision that was in the bill that ensured no funding authorized in the bill will pay for President Trump's wasteful border wall. And the bipartisan language you're removing was debated, amended, and accepted by the Armed Services Committee on a voice vote. Now, does this change mean that the bill does authorize funding meant to be spent by the Department of Defense on our national security to build a wall along the border with Mexico? Today, the Appropriations Committee decided to spend $1.6 billion in taxpayer dollars on the border wall, which is barely a down payment based on cost projections. But here we are ensuring that DOD is going to do the same. I must tell you that I'm really quite shocked at that, particularly because of the committee action that you would amend it to that extent. There's been no floor debate, which we could have handled on the floor if you'd left it in, and contrary to the bipartisan actions of the Armed Services Committee. We'd like to know who asked for the change.
If the gentlewoman would, the amendment said that no money will be spent
On the wall.
on the wall.
But you've taken that out.
But
You've-
that was within the DOD bill, and I don't believe that the DOD has the authority, responsibility, or jurisdiction to build or not build the wall.
Well, Mr.
I don't
Chairman,
think
the
that they
Armed
were-
Services Committee voted 60-1 to keep it in there.
Well, financial services could too, and so could Ways and Means.
Well,
But
do-
that does
does
not
it-
mean
does this
that they
mean
had
that,
the jurisdiction.
Well, did the White House weigh in on this?
You know, I think what they were trying to do, I'll
Okay.
just tell you, Mr. Palazzo came to me and said, look, I would like it if you take that out. We don't have the jurisdiction or the money, and that's what the amendment said. We're not going to spend money, so it's ancillary to the bill.
Wait a minute. He said he didn't want to build it because you don't have the money, but
No,
you're
not in
taking
this,
that out.
not in this.
Yeah.
Not out of NDAA. They do not have the jurisdiction for that.
Well, but what, even to,
Doesn't mean the wall won't be built. It
I'll
means-
say it doesn't. It sounds to me like you're supporting the wall.
Well, I do support the wall.
Yeah.
I do support the wall, but not in this bill.
That's kind of lonely for you, isn't it?
Kind of,
Lonely?
no, I'm not lonely.
All right. But we know that we've only got 4 votes over here, but we'd like to, why is this being self-executed? Why wouldn't we debate
Because
it?
I took it out of the bill. It has no
Yeah.
jurisdictional place in the bill. I appreciate them I think every committee should make their decision to do their own things, but it's not.
Well, that was
within the
60-1
jurisdiction.
was pretty good, wasn't it?
Well,
Yeah.
I
Are you saying
respect
Armed
that.
Services didn't have any jurisdiction over that
they do
wall?
not
Is that
have
what you're saying?
jurisdiction over the wall.
I see, okay.
I mean, I don't know that there was a debate about how you.
Well, there
funded
was.
what
It was
you did.
debated and amended and voice vote.
Well, I don't doubt that. No, I'm talking about the construction of the wall.
Yeah.
You know, one of the questions I'd ask is, where are they going to build it? Because that would want to be a part of the discussion, too. And I don't know that they
Do you,
have that.
you believe that Mexico will pay for it?
Oh, I don't have any, I haven't really thought about whether Mexico would pay.
Does it matter they say they won't?
You know what? I am a great neighbor of Mexico.
Is that an
Great
answer?
neighbor. Texas is. a
Look, we
great
know
neighbor.
Mexico's not going to pay for that wall,
Well-
and you're not going to build one for $1.6
Well,
billion.
and neither is it gonna
But I
be out
really
of the
think it's,
NDAA.
you know, again, it's, we're disturbed by the way this was done. And so I have an amendment to the rule. I
I
move to.
guess I should have called you. Should I have called you and said,
Well, certainly, there's been a lot of buzz about it, would have been nice to know. But we move to strike the language self-executing the amendment by Representative Palazzo from the rule, so that the bipartisan language preventing funds from being used to pay for President Trump's border wall remains in the bill. I think we've pretty self-explanatory, and we've, I'd like to call for a vote, please.
okay, is there further discussion? Seeing none, vote now be on slaughter bin. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
Roll call, please.
Gentlewoman asked for roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins? No. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne? No. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse? No. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck? No. Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney? No. Ms. Slaughter?
Aye.
Ms. Slaughter? Aye. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern? Aye. Mr. Hastings? Yep. Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Polis? Aye. Mr. Polis? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk will report the total.
4 yeas, 9
The
nays.
slaughter amendment is not agreed to, not agreed to. Further amendment or discussion. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, just kind of building on what Ranking Member said, this all seems very strange to me that the Rules Committee would feel it necessary or appropriate.
Excuse me, just, and I apologize.
Right.
I need to go back just a second.
It should have been 8. Is that correct?
Would the gentleman please announce the vote total again?
4 yeas, 8 nays.
The slaughter amendment is not agreed to. Please correct the vote. That it
8 or
was
9.
4 aye, 8 nay. And the slaughter amendment is not agreed to. I apologize.
So that means we still lose?
And
Double,
of course,
for about 2 weeks.
well, that would be a correct. It was not agreed to.
Okay.
Mr. McGovern.
Yeah, no, I just want to build on what the Ranking Member said. This all seems very strange to me that a committee votes to put language into a bill, and then we in the Rules Committee decide to take it out, but we do so in a way that is a little bit kind of sneaky, which is in terms of a self-executed amendment, so that members don't have an opportunity to even.
Gentleman Yield?
Yeah.
What's sneaky about saying we're doing it?
Well, because the deal is that people will end up having to vote for the entire rule, or vote against the rule based on a self-executing amendment that many may not agree with. There's a lot in this bill. There was a decision made to not have a separate vote. I assume that's so that your members aren't put in a difficult spot. So I have an amendment. The amendment is, I move to strike language self-executing the amendment by Representative Palazzo from the rule, and instead to make it an order and give the necessary waivers for the amendment to H.R. 2810 by Representative Palazzo, number 433, which strikes Section 1039 from the legislation. I don't support the amendment. However, it should be in order as a standalone amendment, not self-executed, so that the full House can debate and vote on it. So you can, we can still make it in order, but let's have an up or down vote on it, like we're having an up or down vote on every other amendment that is in this rule. I urge
Discussion.
a yea vote.
Discussion. I think I've got what you're trying to say.
I'm just saying you can do this, but we'll just vote on it, let the whole House vote on it.
But you don't support it.
I will vote no on the amendment on the floor. If it becomes
That's
an
my
order.
point. That's my point.
Well, so what?
No, I'm not questioning the gentleman at all. I'm simply saying, I think
There were
I
many
get
amendments
it.
up here that and we all
You want a
routinely
chance to
advocate.
vote no.
Yeah, well, there's lots of amendments that come before the Rules Committee that many of us would vote no on, but we advocate that they be made in order because we think that in a deliberative body like the House of Representatives, that's the way it should be.
Okay. All right. Okay, further discussion. Vote will now be on the McGovern amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. Noes have it, noes
Ask
have
for
it.
a roll call.
That gentleman asked for a roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins? No. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne? No. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse? No. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck? No. Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney? No. Ms. Slaughter?
Aye.
Ms. Slaughter? Aye. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern? Aye. Mr. Hastings?
I should get 2 yeps this time because there were 2 noes.
Yep.
Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Polis? Aye. Mr. Polis? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk
4
will-
yeas, 8 nays.
The, not agreed to. Further amendment or discussion, gentleman from Colorado.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order and give the necessary waivers for the following amendments to H.R. 23. Amendment number 7 by Representative Huffman, protecting states' rights. Amendment number 8 by Representative Huffman, protecting the fishing industry. Amendment number 11 by Representative McNerney, protecting agricultural and fishing jobs, and Amendment Number 12 by Representatives Torres and Huffman, protecting tribal water rights.
Okay, discussion? Seeing none, vote now be on the proposed amendment. Those in favor say an aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Those have it, those have it.
Roll call?
Gentlemen, ask for roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole, Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins, no. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne, no. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck, no. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney, no. Ms. Slaughter.
Aye.
Ms. Slaughter, aye. Mr. McGovern. Aye. Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings.
Yes.
Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis.
Aye.
Mr. Polis, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report the total.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
The amendment's not agreed to for a minute or discussion. Gentleman from Colorado.
Just discussion.
Yes, sir.
I'm trying to understand the implications of the amendment in nature of the substitute that's modified by the amendment printed in Part A, which strikes the language that the committee put in about none of the funds authorized to be appropriated may be used to plan, develop, or construct any barriers, including walls or fences along the international border. So if that language is struck, does that mean that the funds authorized in the bill can in fact be used to build a wall on our borders?
What that means is that there will be no money in the NDAA authorization for the building of a wall.
But that's already the case in the chairman's mark, which is my understanding is being modified now in this rule.
We simply, I believe, have struck the language would be the correct term.
Striking the language from the chairman's mark. But it's your understanding that still, under this bill, there's no funds that are authorized for use of the...
There are no funds.
Okay, I thank the gentleman.
Yes, sir. Okay. Further discussion. All right, the vote will now be on the motion from the gentleman from Louisville, Texas. Those in favor of the Burgess Amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Roll call.
Gentlewoman asks for a roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole, Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins, aye. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne, aye. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck, aye. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney, aye. Ms. Slaughter.
No.
Ms. Slaughter, no. Mr. McGovern. Mr. McGovern, no. Mr. Hastings. Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis. Mr. Polis, no. Mr. Chairman.
Yes. Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk will report.
8 yeas, 4 nays.
The motion is agreed to, and accordingly, the gentleman, Mr. Byrne, will be handling this rule for Republicans,
And Mr. Polis for the Democrat.
and Mr. Polis will be handling this for Democrats. I note in the crowd that we have a familiar face. Yes, it's Katie Clary, but it's also Hugh Halprin. Mr. Halprin, it's good to see you. I'm sure you've missed us. Your service to the committee for these years has been appreciated, and we're delighted that you've been able to come see us from the speakers, crack staff, and we appreciate you a lot. Is there any other business before the committee, Mr. McGovern?
So I'm just noticing, we have several amendments made in order today, but I don't see the McGovern amendment on Afghanistan in here.
Well, as a matter of fact, we're going to allow, I believe tomorrow, the opportunity for Mr. McGovern to make a case at that. As I had previously stated, and the gentleman may not have been here, or I may not have done a very good job, but we were going to try and take the two bills tonight and offer the committee chairman the chance and the ranking member to give their testimony, and then take amendments that we felt like would be non-controversial, make them in order, and begin the process. And then we'll come back with a new round starting tomorrow. And with that said, I'm about to receive a sheet of paper that tells me,
Yeah, I just didn't want you to forget me, that's all.
and, well, I wouldn't forget, but I would say that 3 o'clock tomorrow, we're going to be reconvening with an opportunity for you to be cheery-faced and come
I will
and
be ready.
offer your ideas, and Mr. Polis will be able to offer his amendments, and I look forward to that.
What about Hastings?
Well, the judge can do that, and you can too. We'll do that. And, any other business? Okay, we're done. Thank you.